My name is Vicky and I'm a speech and language therapist, and today we're going to talk about the topic of help, my child is not talking. And we're going to talk about early language development and things to watch out for, and what are the developmental norms, and when you might want to seek support. So first, let's have a think about this question. What are you concerned about? Often we think my child's not talking, but that can mean different things to different parents or different guardians, and we have to decide first if we're concerned about a child's speech or their language. So in the early years, speech and language therapists or speech and language pathologists will often advise that if a child doesn't have sufficient language skills, that we may not be able to assess their speech sound skills. And that's how therapists differentiate between the two skills, and also they develop in different ways and at different times. So that's important to think about. Does your child use any words as of now? How does your child communicate? Or if your child does use lots of words and language, are they then understandable or comprehensible to the people who they are very familiar with? So speech difficulties and speech delays will be covered in a different video, but today we will actually be talking about language development. So that means how a child understands language and how a child uses language, and whether or not those things are delayed. So let's talk about receptive language first. Receptive language is a professional term used to describe the understanding or comprehension levels of a child. So this means whether or not a child can understand instructions, can they understand concept words, can they understand the situation or the context around them, and can they also understand basically what's being said to them. So the development of language understanding, like everything in child development, follows a bit of a process. So in the very early years, 0 to 12 months, children tend to understand familiar situations, context, and routine. So for example, a child may know that when the sky goes a bit dark and mom starts to stand up and gather them up, it's time for bedtime or it's time for a bath. They may know that if their parents begin walking to the door, that it's time to go out. So that's understanding of context. At 12 to 18 months, children tend to understand one keyword. So that means one important word in the sentence. So for example, if you have a couple items on the table and you say, "Give me the car," they can probably understand the word car and give you the car. So at 2 years, children tend to understand two keywords and begin to develop an understanding of both nouns, so naming words, and actions, verbs. So for example, they may understand if you say, "Girl, jump," and they might be able to make a doll jump, for example. Or they may understand the word "boy, eat." Understand the phrase, "boy, eat." And then at 3 years, children tend to understand three keywords and begin to get to grasp the concept of positions and describing words. So for example, you can say, "Put the banana on the box," and they would understand that. Where on, they would understand on, they would understand banana, they would understand box. And then at 4 years, they tend to understand four keywords and begin to grasp more abstract concepts, like abstract adjectives or describing words. So it's important to remember that often we think that children understand language a lot more than they may do, especially if you're very familiar with the child. So at home, because everything is familiar, and at school that a child has gone through for a while, everything is familiar, you may think that the child is able to follow instructions. But if you think about it, things like "put on your coat, put on your shoes, and let's go outside," that may be a long instruction and seem to have lots of keywords. But if everyone else in the class is doing the same thing, or everyone at home is doing the same thing, the child can get by just by using contextual understanding and not necessarily have to understand those words. So it's important to keep that in mind, and also gauge a little about whether or not your child can understand novel instructions. So maybe words that they've not really used or heard before, or don't use or hear on a daily basis. And you can try to check their understanding on whether or not they can, hand you specific items, put them in specific places, and things like that, not just based on their day-to-day understanding of their daily routine. So some strategies that you can use to support receptive language if you think that your child is not quite understanding some of the things that you're saying, or not having an understanding that's age appropriate, then you could try doing things like first gaining their attention before doing any instructions or telling them anything, or make sure that you're both actually looking at and paying attention to the same thing before you give any instructions or tell them something about that item. Make lots of comments on what your child is doing. So the more language your child hears, particularly if it's in line with what they're doing or what they're looking at, then the more exposure they have and more potential they have to learn those words. You can also use nonverbal communication methods. So for example, you could point, you could gesture, you could sign to show a child or to support your child's understanding. And you can also use other visual aids such as pictures, photographs, for example, to show your child where they're going, or to give them a choice of items, or just to introduce new nouns and verbs to them. Now, in terms of expressive language, now this is what a lot of parents are concerned about when they come to visit a speech and language therapist. Oftentimes, you'll have children at age 2 or 3 coming into the clinic with minimal language or minimal verbs, minimal language or minimal words. And parents are concerned because they can see that their child doesn't seem to have as many words as other children their age. And this is typically what parents mean when they say speech. My child doesn't speak, or my child has no speech. We're concerned about their speech. But actually, the main concern there is concern about language, or the use of language. So, before we talk about language development, we have to think about why we produce language. So why a child would be motivated to use and produce language on a day-to-day basis. So we may use language to request objects or information. We may use language to protest, to say yes, to say no, to give commands, to comment or acknowledge something that someone has said or shown us. We may use language to get attention. We may use language for other social purposes, like to interact with someone. So, one of the nice things to think about when we're thinking about language production is, does your child have enough opportunities to produce language? So have you observed that they are not producing language in multiple scenarios, or is it that your child doesn't have too much of a need to produce language sometimes? So let's take a look at typical development. So this is a lot more complex because there's lots of things that go into language production. So at age 1 to 2, children typically develop their first words at age 1, so around 12 months. So between the age of 1 and 2, they begin to use lots of single words and maybe some simple 2-word phrases. So for example, they may say juice or more juice, or daddy, mummy, where's daddy, where's mummy. They could have a vocabulary between 20 and 50 words by the age of 2. And they use a lot of naming words. So those are typically the first things that children develop. So like doggy or mummy or daddy. So those are all naming words. And then they might also produce some verbs, which are action words. So common things like wash, eat, drink, they may have those. And then children may also use language for the purposes of acknowledging. So like, yeah, some children say that to show that they've heard you. They may use language for requesting, so to get more or milk or food or crisps, things like that. Or they may use it to answer simple questions from the adults around them. At the age of 2 or 3, children tend to use 1 to 3 word phrases. So things like daddy go eat or Teddy eat apple. There is a great vocabulary spurt between the ages of 2 and 3, and children tend to have more than 300 words in their vocabulary at that point. They can start to use some prepositions, so it's a little bit in line with their receptive language, if you remember from that slide. They can use in, on, words like that. They can begin to use some verb endings like ing, so jumping, running. And they're also developing the use of in plural nouns, so like apple, 2 apples. And they're also beginning to kind of understand the concept of politeness, so they may use please or thank you, although this is typically not something that speech and language therapists may place a lot of emphasis on if they're working with your child who has a language delay. Between the ages of 3 or 4, they can use more than 4 words in short sentences. They can use possessive S, so like John's bag. They can use small words like a, an, and the, so an apple, a horse, the boy. And they are also beginning to use other grammatical forms like is, so she is jumping, I am eating. And they can use language to add information on a topic. They can talk about things that are not in their immediate context, so they can begin to tell you, for example, stories about their day, stories about a favorite toy, and things like that. And between the ages of 4 and 5, children begin to construct pretty long and complex sentences and start to use conjunctions, so words, connecting words like and because in their stories. They can report on past events. They can reason with you. They can express empathy and feelings of emotions, and they can maintain interactions. So they can hold a conversation with you, and it's not sort of up to you to carry that conversation. So that's what typical development looks like. Now, it's important to remember that this can be different in different languages. So it may be worth looking up resources in your own language to see if your child's language development is in line with their native or strongest language. So to support language production, it's really important that we actually create opportunities for communication. When toddlers and children are very young, we tend to fulfill all of their needs because they're little. But that also means that we may be taking away opportunities for actual communication. So because a child is very comfortable in their environment, they may know exactly what to do to get what they want. They can just point and someone will give them what they want, or they can just grab and they'll be allowed to do so. But to develop language, it's important to give children opportunities to do so. So that may mean putting things up higher so that they can't reach it and they have to ask for help, or giving them choices and withholding those choices where they can see them but can't grab them, and then model the language that they need to use. So that creates an opportunity for a child to actually ask for something and use their language, not just gestures or physical actions or behavior even sometimes, to grab or get the things they want or need. We can model the correct sentences. So this is applicable for modeling different words that you want your child to begin to learn. And also model grammatical corrections for your child. Although because grammatical development happens over a period of time, we model but don't necessarily push the child to repeat exactly or get it right every time. So for example, if your child says, I eat a cake, you might say, yes, you ate cake. And we don't always expect them to repeat that model because otherwise it gets a bit tiring for the child. We comment on what the child is doing to encourage interaction. And we make language modeling a part of everyday life so that the child has more opportunities to practice copying and using those words in a functional everyday context. Now, when should you be concerned about language development? So, for receptive language, if you find that your child doesn't seem to understand some of the things you say, or doesn't seem to be able to follow instructions that have the number of keywords appropriate for their age, then you might seek support to see if there are any receptive language difficulties there. But most parents will notice more of the expressive language difficulties, especially when their child is not speaking or using as many words as they might expect for their child's age, or for their child compared to a child's sibling, or for their child compared to other children they've seen. It's good to go and get your concerns checked out via an assessment or a consultation with a speech and language therapist if you are concerned that your child is delayed or behind. Or if your child gets to, let's say, wouldn't be too concerned at age 1, but if your child gets to age 1.5 and 2 and still has no words or has very minimal number of words, then you might be starting to seek some support around your child's language development. And the way to do that is to contact a speech and language therapist or speech and language pathologist. They're both the same profession with different titles in your area, and see if you can get a consultation or assessment in so that you can discuss your concerns with them, and they can tell you if something is something to be concerned about, or whether or not it's just one part of child development and you don't have to be too concerned at this time because they're still at an age-appropriate stage, or they're just mildly delayed. And if you're concerned about a child's speech sounds, we'll discuss that in a different video, but that will be about their pronunciation and how clear they are, which also follows a pattern of development. So, in conclusion, receptive and expressive language in children follow a developmental pattern. So they have different levels of understanding and different abilities to use language as they grow older. And you should check out any concerns that you have with a speech and language therapist as soon as you have them, actually. If you have any questions, a speech and language therapist would be more than happy to answer them for you, and they could tell you if intervention is required at this time. Thank you, and feel free to check out our other videos on speech development, language development, different kinds of disorders, and other things that a speech and language therapist works on.